She said she wouldn't be intimidated. In 2024, Chinese agents planned a collision with her car in Prague. This time, her team encountered a drone intrusion in Belgian airspace, according to a Taiwan diplomat quoted by CNA. Despite all this, Taiwan's vice president returned to Europe's heart this month to deliver a speech in the European Parliament building.
We don't just want to survive, we want democracies to thrive.
It was the keynote address at the annual summit of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, which numbers hundreds of elected lawmakers from governments around the world. To what lengths will China go to continue to silence Taiwan and isolate it from the international community? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Leonard Zhao, National Tsinghua University adjunct professor, and Marcin Jezewski, European Values Center for Security Policy, Taiwan office head. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. So, Ambassador Zhao, let me come to you first. So, Taiwanese Foreign Minister Lin Jialong, who did actually accompany our Vice President, called the IPAC event, let me quote, a historic step for Taiwan's diplomacy and a new stage in Taiwan-EU relations. On that trip, he also said that they forged deeper cooperation on semiconductors and AI. What's your view?
Well, in general, I'm very happy to see that happen because as a long time, veteran diplomat I am, and I recall that when I first joined the Foreign Service many years ago, in MOFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, my department, American desk, were driven like crazy because we were focusing on American affairs at all times, as you can imagine that. But in comparison, Europe, our next door, the office of the European Department, very quiet. Nothing was being done. I found it very, very amusing.
And how about Hsiao Bi-khim's speech in the European Parliament building? Was it, a big deal?
I think, it's a matter of interpretation, but I admire, Bi-khim because she's a fluent English speaker. We used to work together in Washington many years ago, and I think I'd like to congratulate her for the great job. And at least she was the first sitting Vice President of Taiwan to deliver such a speech at the European Parliament, although not a European Parliament hosted, but it's a European Parliament premises. I say we deliver the Taiwan story in the semiconductor and the supply chain, security, all the core important issues being released, being better demonstrated by our Vice President, which is a good step to begin with.
Okay, Marcin, a historic step.
A historic step indeed, and we need to bear in mind that the European Parliament has been a long-standing harbinger of expansion of ties, informal, albeit substantive, between Europe and Taiwan. Therefore, this event, hosted on the premises of the European Parliament, demonstrates that within the European policy community, whether at the level of the EU27 bloc or individual member states, the conversation about threats to European security and Europe's democratic resilience brought about by China are taken into consideration with increasing gravity. And even though, indeed, the leadership of the European Parliament might not have been formally involved in making this event happen, this is clearly a sign that the European Union is realizing that its own One China policy actually has a lot of flexibility when it comes to these informal engagements with Taiwan, that has increasingly cemented its position as a like-minded partner in its own right, rather than only a sore wound in the overall landscape of relations between Europe and China.
Yeah, because Marcin, when China complained, as it did, to the European Parliament, the EU, reaffirmed its One China policy, as you said, and it insisted the event was not official and that parliamentary leaders had no contact with Hsiao Bi-khim. So how do you read that?
Indeed, it is a very European form of compromise that was reached in terms of how Bi-khim Hsiao was hosted on the premises of the European Parliament. Within the context of European politics and especially the European Union, we benefit from spaces for these types of compromises to occur because of the multi-level governance structure of the EU and sort of different limitations that are imposed on different bodies. But Chinese reaction is not surprising, not only because it harms what China sees as its a vital national and strategic interest, meaning the claim to Taiwan, but also it is a very sensitive time in relations between the European Parliament specifically and Chinese stakeholders. In this current European Parliament, elected by EU citizens last year, there has been an effort to quote-unquote normalize relations with China and to open cross-parliamentary dialogue. We recently witnessed the first visit of Chinese officials to the European Parliament. In this presidential term, President Metsola herself has made great efforts to open up to China. So this is also clearly a form of counterweight and a democratic symbol within the European Parliament structures that engagement with China should not happen at the cost of closing the EP once again to Taiwan.
Right. And Ambassador, China has labelled, as we've heard many times, VP Hsiao a major Taiwan independence separatist. Now, interestingly, in the US, Representative Adam Smith said last week, he said that Beijing exaggerates Taiwan independence. This allows them to then, carry out their coercive and punitive actions in response. What do you make of that analysis?
Well, China has been using these terms of Taiwan independence, many times, repeatedly. I think that is for China to consider. They should grow up. The international affairs has been getting more, diversified, and so it shouldn't kind of simplify the meaning of so-called Taiwan independence or unification.
Because what does that mean? What does Taiwan independence mean? Does it mean anything where you don't say that Taiwan is part of China?
Well, that is a long story. But I think Taiwan independence, I used to tell the mainland Chinese schoolmates when I was in study at Harvard. I say you shouldn't simplify. You shouldn't just so naive to think that Taiwan independence it means no good for Taiwan. But you have to have a deep, consideration, deep research on why Taiwanese have such a thought. I think it's one of the options for Taiwanese people. Unification could be also another option. But so don't too much stigmatize. I think they're making a big mistake, serious mistake.
Even in terms of what we described there, in terms of independence or unification, of course, there's also the de facto independence, and therefore that's the status quo, which most of Taiwanese actually want, rather than moving to independence. Do you see Adam Smith as basically calling out Beijing's strategy and tactic there in terms of making this a political label rather than a descriptive label?
Absolutely. I think that Representative Smith is absolutely right to point out that this claim is exaggerated precisely because we are not operating with very concrete definitions. And also looking at his claims or his analysis from the perspective of transatlantic relations, both the United States and the European Union have stated that it is in our respective interests to see the maintenance, the upholding of the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And of course, it would be beneficial for China and China-linked actors to interpret this as US and EU opposition to so-called Taiwanese independence. And it is true. That's why both sides of the Atlantic are maintaining their respective one China policies. But at the same time, there is not much appetite to see full unification either, because that would also be an alteration to the existing status quo.
Okay. In last year's IPAC 2024 summit, which was held in Taipei, IPAC launched its 2758 initiative to push back on China's distortion of the 1971 UN Resolution 2758, which it has used to falsely state that Taiwan is part of China. IPAC says United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758 was passed in 1971 and transfers China's seat at the UN from the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek to the People's Republic of China. It does not address the sovereignty of Taiwan, which is not mentioned. Neither does it preclude Taiwan from representation at the United Nations or other international organizations. Ambassador, if I can come to you, why was this campaign by IPAC so necessary?
Because that is a matter, related to Taiwan's, the identification, because so far I think the AIT first initiated this issue, and then so mainland China, China has come up with a very strong reaction to AIT's, initiatives of the interpretation of this 48 resolution. But and then IPAC had to react to Chinese, protest or reaction.
How bad is the distortion on the side of Beijing, though, in your view?
They deliberately want to distort it. Actually, I think no one is trying to distort the meaning, but now the Chinese it's our turn to say something. We have to distort. So I think they know that what they're talking about, because this resolution has nothing to do with an argument that Taiwan is a part of China. Nothing to do with that.
Martin, a few days later, former President Tsai Ying-wen addressed the Berlin Freedom Conference, and her message was that now is the time for democracies to act together against autocracies. I wanted to ask you both what you make of her message and this timing, but also the double impact of having both Bi-khim and Tsai Ying-wen in Europe, kind of like these back-to-back coordinated visits.
When it comes to having these two visits happen in parallel, I think it's really important to highlight how these two Taiwanese high-profile representatives were able to speak to very different groups of stakeholders, and this is extremely necessary. So the visit of sitting Vice President Bi-khim Hsiao was a part of IPAC's activities, so she was speaking to members of the European Parliament who have this dual role of representing the voice of their constituents, both at the level of the EU and then back in the constituencies, whereas the Berlin Freedom Forum was a very impactful message to the civil society and policy community, specifically in Germany. In the past, there have been other attempts to have Tsai Ying-wen make a public appearance in Berlin that has previously been met with some opposition, for example, from the German Foreign Office. So these two speeches deliver important messages to different groups of stakeholders, but they are also breakthroughs in their own way, and that is extremely noteworthy. I think that overall, many of the activities pursued by IPAC to focus specifically on the Brussels events are somewhat defensive in nature, in the sense that they create a platform to counteract activities pursued by China. And the 2758 campaign is a perfect example of that, because China has encouraged a lot of its allies, countries like, for example, Pakistan, to actively repeat its distorted interpretation of the resolution. So the more conversations we see that counter this Chinese effort at building its own discourse power, the stronger the democratic narrative becomes.
Okay. Now, meanwhile, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in a call with Germany's Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul, highlighted that Beijing had unconditionally supported German reunification, using it as an analogy to urge Germany to understand China's anti-Taiwan independence stance. Now, this comes after Minister Wadephul postponed his first trip to China last month after Beijing confirmed only one of his requested meetings. During a trip to Tokyo in August, Wadephul highlighted Beijing's, quote, increasingly aggressive behavior in the region. And in October, Reuters reported that he reaffirmed Germany's one China policy, but that there must be, quote, no violent change of the status quo. Now, both of these remarks angered Beijing. Ambassador, so we can see that the German foreign minister, the new one this time, is taking a very tough stance on China's aggressions in this region, and outrightly saying that China should not use force. Where, therefore, does that leave China?
Well, okay, in general, the current relation between China and Germany is kind of, is ups and downs. It's sitting on the rocks, because there was a high time for relations between two countries, but now it's in the low tides. So we know that in Germany, the government has many parties. I personally had a pleasure of meeting and talking with a group of German, parliamentary delegation members in Taipei not too long ago. They come up with the idea. I think they belong to the Green Party one of the parties of the Germany. And then, so I think that Germany, they come up with a very strong, sympathy and support to Taiwan. So in contrast, they have some, a reservation on China. I sense that. But this time, they got a new foreign minister. Obviously, I think he was not very well informed, by his staff about the relations, the sensitivity of the relations between China and Germany, because the German, the leader, they are trying to approach China for economic and trade reasons, as you know, because Germany, the relations with Donald Trump in the U.S. has not been very smooth.
Let's bring in Marcin. Do you think that he was not well informed, or do you think he's sort of answering that call from former President Tsai Ying-wen that democracies need to stand together?
Germany has long been considered to be a weak link in Europe's efforts to build a more assertive strategy vis-à-vis China. And that's very strongly connected to Germany's economic interests in China, particularly those of the automotive sector, an extremely important part of the German economy. However, as much as former German Chancellor's Olaf Scholz's call to realize that we are now in a Zeitenwende, the change of times, even though this call referred more to the situation in Europe and Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine, I believe that the German leadership is increasingly realizing that the Zeitenwende refers also to Europe's relations with China. So what I mean by that specifically is that after years of peace dividend that prioritized economic considerations in shaping Germany's approach to China, now is the time to put security first. And Taiwan is a part of the European interest calculus because our security and prosperity are interconnected. And because of that, because of this strategic change of mindset and priorities, we are seeing gradual intensification of this assertiveness in how Germany talks about Taiwan and how Germany engages with China on the topic of how its interests are also located here in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, and briefly, since you are a European, I want to ask you about this parallel that Wang Yi attempts to draw, the splitting of Germany and its reunification. What do you make of that parallel?
I believe that this is a very superficial comparison. To me, comparing German reunification to the prospect of annexation of Taiwan by China is an apples to oranges comparison. One important dimension that this superficial comparison ignores is simply the self-identification of people on both sides. We have very concrete data that shows that in the last decades, Taiwanese identity has really consolidated as separate from the Chinese. And even though connections may exist in the cultural domain, Taiwan does belong to the global sinosphere, so do many other sovereign states like Singapore or Chinatowns around the world. And this doesn't mean that the cultural connection, the sinospheric connection, is a basis for political unification. Therefore, I think that this comparison really misses the mark and is misread, I believe, deliberate and malicious of these very different socio-cultural arrangements in 1980s Germany and today's Taiwan and China.
Right.
If I may add a few words, that I think looking down the road, it's almost for sure that China is going to come up with more strong and more tighten up their diplomatic tone. Okay. Very, very, that they would rather be not very gentleman-like. They rather be more like a fighting wolf. Fighting wolf diplomacy is coming back again.
The wolf warrior.
That's right.
Yeah.
Korea, I think also Japan. This morning I heard that Japan, the Chinese consul, only a consul, not a consul general in Osaka, in Japan. He came out with some very strong words about the prime minister of Japan by saying something about that.
And how is that received, though? Because my next question was, about Wang Yi or the Chinese lecturing the Germans. How does that work in comparison to what Tsai Ying-wen and Bi-khim did, which is they talk about the shared challenges or the shared threats and the shared values with the Europeans? Which is more persuasive?
Well, kind of make a long story short, I was told that now in China, within the Chinese power hierarchy, the leader, Xi Jinping, he came up with a very tightened control, surveillance of his people's control. So the people below him, that they would rather more kind of play safe, although they knew that if they say something outside China to the international community, they will not be very popular, but they don't care. I say that not for Japanese, not for German people. I say that for my boss in Beijing.
Yeah, so
to
domestic
play safe,
audience.
to
right.
secure their jobs.
Yeah.
So I think that is, so that's why I always, teasing, not always, sometimes I say that, PRC stands for what? Public Relations Calamity.
I do remember that, Ambassador. Yeah. Okay, let's go to the last question. Another Taiwanese labeled as a separatist by Beijing is DPP legislator Puma Shen. China has escalated its October campaign targeting Shen by releasing a Chinese CCTV report calling for Shen's global arrest through Interpol. In late October, the Chongqing Municipal Public Security Bureau had opened that investigation into Shen for separatist activity centered on his Kuma Academy, which offers training courses for civilians in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The CCTV report ends with this.
收手吧，否则下一个是你。
Marcin, what do you make of this? Is it an escalation on the part of Beijing towards Taiwanese? Would Interpol arrest Shen?
I would like to see this instance of intimidation campaign targeting Puma Shen as a piece of a bigger puzzle that China is trying to complete as it tries to instrumentalize the global law enforcement cooperation institutions. So when it comes to Taiwan's exclusion from the United Nations system, one of the most renowned examples is its exclusion from the World Health Assembly. But another body in which Taiwan used to enjoy an observer status and no longer does so is the Interpol. We are actually gearing up for the 93rd Global Assembly of Interpol on November 24th to 27th. Taiwan is once again not given a seat at the table. And Interpol is an extremely important or a body for China precisely because Beijing sees it as a tool, for instance, for perpetuating its transnational repression. The importance of Interpol to China is also further illustrated by the fact that for the first time, Hong Kong, now under Iron Fist rule of Beijing, will for the first time ever host the 94th Global Assembly of Interpol next year. So to bring it all back to Puma Shen, this is just a part of China's broader political warfare campaign. It is another example of China's Lawfare, a critical element of its free warfare's doctrine of political warfare, elaborated in the in the beginning of the century. So Puma Shen is just one pawn in this bigger game that China is playing with Interpol.
Ambassador, are Taiwanese intimidated by this kind of thing?
No, I don't think so. Because no any single Taiwanese will be subject to the Chinese legal jurisdiction. Let alone that they mentioned about Interpol. But I have to emphasize one thing here, that the Interpol itself does not have the authority to arrest anyone. It's not a police force. It's simply, it has no agents to carry out for law enforcement, but it serves as a coordination and the information sharing body among the member countries of the police agencies. So Interpol is actually an administration. It's not a police force.
So is it down to those individual member countries who have relations with China then?
Yeah, it does.
Do you see this kind of thing escalating and expanding?
We are definitely seeing an expansion of China's Lawfare campaign. The anti-secession law as such was passed in 2005. So it was a form of response by the PRC to what they saw as de-Sinicization and excessive Taiwanization of this polity under former President Chen Shui-bian. Last year, we saw the publication of concrete articles that have sort of allowed an operationalization of that anti-secession law. And to this end, I believe that China is looking at it at its existing instruments as well as devising new ones to deepen the instrumentalization of its domestic and international legal tools to achieve its objectives of intimidation and and repression. But in general, I believe that there is clearly a threat that countries that are more dependent on political and economic support from China would fall in line and act on, let's say, an Interpol red notice that might be issued against someone like Legislator Shen. Legislator Shen family has business interests in Ecuador, for example, and given the importance of fossil fuel diplomacy between Quito and Beijing, Ecuador has fallen quite firmly into Beijing's pocket. So in general, these types of activities, at the very least, make people ask themselves, second-guess themselves, if they can travel, if they can meet their families, if they can attend international events, and so on.
Ambassador, final question to you. So what can Taiwan do about this?
I'm afraid that, to be honest, there are not much, that can be done by the Taiwanese government, except for some maybe a negotiation or communication between the two sides, between Taipei and Beijing. But so far, I think, the Interpol has also several member states, which are the Taiwanese diplomatic allies. We can spread the words around those countries in Interpol. So let them pass our message. China, although they have the power, more power than Taiwan, but I think still they have a certain limit. So let's wait and see.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Leonard Zhao and Marcin Niedzewski, for joining Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.